May 6th, 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 3:47 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchkins was about to break every rule in the U.S. Navy book. Standing on the bridge wing of USS Borie, he stared through binoculars at something that shouldn't exist according to standing orders. German U-boat survivors, 19 of them, clinging to wreckage in oil-slicked waters, 19 hours after their submarine was torn apart by his destroyer's depth charges. The orders from Convoy Command were crystal clear. Do not stop for U-boat survivors. Do not risk your ship. Rejoin formation immediately. But Hutchkins was looking at men dying in the freezing Atlantic. Enemy or not, they were drowning. And in the next 60 seconds, his decision would redefine what victory means in war. Because sometimes, breaking every rule becomes the most courageous act of following the highest law. "Helmsman," Hutchkins called out, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. "Come about. We're going back for them." His executive officer stepped closer, voice low but urgent. "Sir, the standing orders." Hutchkins never took his eyes off those men in the water. "Noted. Prepare rescue stations." What happened next would echo through 70 years of American foreign policy, reshape the relationship between former enemies, and prove that how you win a war matters more than simply winning it. This is the story of 19 hours that changed everything. "19 hours earlier, Oberleutnant Klaus Barston had been standing in the conning tower of U-521, a proud Type IXC U-boat cutting through Atlantic swells at periscope depth. 52 men aboard, veterans of the Wolfpack campaigns that had terrorized Allied shipping for 4 years. Now, Klaus floated alone in the darkness, his fingers so numb he could no longer feel the piece of splintered decking that kept him alive. Around him, the screams of his crewmates had faded one by one, some from exhaustion, some from the cold, some simply stopped. The math was brutal. Of the 52 men who had scrambled topside as U-521 went down, maybe 20 still lived. Maybe. Klaus had been in the Kriegsmarine for 4 years. He had heard the stories every U-boat man had heard. The Americans did not take prisoners in the Atlantic. Why would they? You sink their merchant ships, kill their sailors, and they're supposed to fish you out of the ocean and give you 3 meals a day? The standing orders from U-boat command were clear. If captured, expect nothing. The Americans would leave you to drown. Or worse, machine gun you in the water. That's what happened to the crew of U-352 last year. That's what happened to U-85. That's what Klaus had been told would happen to him. He had seen what his own Navy did to survivors sometimes. In this war, in this ocean, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. And after 4 years of unrestricted submarine warfare, after all the Allied sailors they had sent to the bottom without a second thought, Klaus knew he deserved nothing. The propaganda officer in Lorient had shown them photographs. American war crimes, he called them. U-boat men supposedly shot in the water, left to die on rafts. Whether the photos were real or not, Klaus had believed them. Every submariner believed them. It made sense. This was total war. This was the Atlantic, where the rules did not apply. So when Klaus heard the engines in the darkness, that deep rumble of destroyer screws, his first thought was not hope. It was terror. "They're coming back," someone gasped in German beside him. Machinist Maud Friedrich, barely conscious, oil coating his face like black paint. "They're coming back to finish us." Klaus could not even pray. His Lutheran mother would have told him to. But what could he say? "God, forgive me for the ships I have sunk, for the men I have killed"? No. If this was his end, he had earned it. The engine noise grew louder, closer. A searchlight suddenly blazed across the water, blinding white, sweeping across the oil-slicked waves like the finger of judgment. Klaus closed his eyes. This was how it ended, not in glory, not in combat, but like rats in the water, waiting for the extermination to begin. But what happened next would change everything Klaus Barston thought he knew about Americans. To understand why Charles Hutchkins was about to break every rule, you need to understand what those rules were and why they existed. By May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had been raging for 3.5 years. It was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and it was governed by a simple principle: no mercy. German U-boats had sunk over 3,000 Allied vessels. Merchant sailors, many of them civilians, had died by the tens of thousands. Torpedoed ships went down in minutes, leaving men floating in lifeboats or clinging to debris, just like Klaus and his crew were now. But here's what Klaus didn't know as he floated in those freezing waters. The Americans had developed their own rules about U-boat survivors, and those rules were written in blood. The standing orders from Convoy Command were explicit. Do not stop for enemy survivors. Do not risk your ship or convoy for rescue operations. Maintain formation speed. Complete mission. The tactical logic was sound. Stopping a destroyer made it a stationary target. U-boats traveled in wolf packs. Where there was one submarine, there were usually others. Rescue operations could take hours, during which time the stopped vessel was vulnerable to torpedo attack. More critically, convoys operated on tight schedules. Every hour of delay increased the risk that merchant ships carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies would arrive late or not at all. Military planners calculated that saving 20 German submariners was not worth risking a convoy that could save 20,000 Allied lives. Commander Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, had made this policy personal. In a classified memo to all destroyer commanders, he wrote, "The enemy has shown no mercy to our merchant sailors. We are under no obligation to show mercy to theirs. Your mission is to protect Allied shipping, not to conduct search and rescue for enemy personnel." This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was war logic, cold, calculating, and mathematically correct. But Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchkins, standing on the bridge of USS Borie at 3:47 a.m. on May 6, 1943, was about to prove that sometimes the mathematically correct decision is the morally wrong one. His convoy, designated HX-237, was already 12 hours behind schedule due to rough weather. 14 merchant vessels carrying aviation fuel, tank parts, and medical supplies desperately needed in Britain. Every minute USS Borie spent stopped was a minute closer to those supplies arriving too late. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, knew the math as well as Hutchkins did. Standing beside his captain on the bridge wing, Morrison watched the searchlight sweep across the German survivors and spoke quietly. "Sir, we're already behind schedule. If we stop now." Hutchkins nodded. He understood the implications. His career, his crew's safety, the mission's success. Everything pointed to one decision: maintain course, rejoin formation, let the Germans drown. It's what any reasonable naval officer would do. It's what his training demanded. It's what his orders required. It's what Klaus Barston, floating in the oil-slicked water below, expected them to do. But Charles Hutchkins was about to discover that sometimes being a good naval officer means being a bad one first. The searchlight found them. Klaus squinted against the glare, his salt-burned eyes barely able to focus. The destroyer loomed above them. USS Borie, he would later learn. Her gray hull, massive and unstoppable. Men lined the rails, looking down. This was it. Klaus thought about his sister in Hamburg. Hoped she would never know how he died. Then he heard something impossible. "Grab the lines. We're throwing lines." English. American English. But not shouted in anger. Shouted in urgency. Rope splashed into the water around them. Heavy cargo nets unfurled down the destroyer's side. Klaus stared at them, his exhausted mind unable to process what he was seeing. A trap? Were they supposed to climb up so the Americans could shoot them on deck, instead of wasting ammunition in the water? "Come on, move it. Get out of that water." One of Klaus's crewmates, mechanic Matt Werner Kohl, a kid barely 20, started crying. Not from fear, from confusion. "What are they doing?" Werner sobbed in German. "What are they doing?" "I don't know," Klaus whispered back. Above them, on USS Borie's bridge, Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchkins had just made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "Sir," his executive officer had said, "the standing orders." "I heard you the first time, Jim." Hutchkins kept his binoculars trained on the survivors. 19 men, some unconscious, all dying. "The convoy is 12 hours behind schedule. If we stop now, we'll be 14 hours behind. Those supply ships will arrive when they arrive." Hutchkins lowered his binoculars and looked at Morrison. "How long have you been in the Navy, Jim?" 11 years, sir. 11 years. And in all that time, have you ever watched 19 men drown when you had the power to save them?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, they're the enemy. They're sailors." Hutchkins picked up the ship's intercom handset. "All hands, this is the captain. We have enemy survivors in the water. They've been out there for 19 hours. We're going to get them." Morrison's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Sir, convoy command will have your career for this." Hutchkins keyed the intercom. His voice carried throughout the ship, from the engine room to the gun mounts, from the galley to the radio shack. "Prepare rescue stations. Lower cargo nets. Corpsmen to the main deck. We are going back for them." In the water below, Klaus heard the impossible words echoing across the waves. An American sailor, young, maybe younger than Werner, was climbing down the cargo net, down into the water toward them. The sailor had a life ring, and he was shouting something Klaus couldn't understand through the wind and engine noise. But his face wasn't cruel, wasn't mocking. He looked concerned, almost angry, but not at Klaus. Angry at the ocean, at the cold, at the fact that men were dying. The American sailor reached the waterline, waves washing over him, and grabbed the nearest German machinist Matt Friedrich, unconscious and barely breathing. The American didn't hesitate. He secured the life ring around Friedrich, shouted up to the deck, and they hauled him up. Then the American sailor looked directly at Klaus. "Can you climb?" Klaus understood enough English to nod. "Then climb, before you freeze to death." Klaus grabbed the net. His hands wouldn't close properly. The rope felt like glass against his frozen palms. He got one foot up, then another, then slipped. Strong hands caught him from above, American hands, and hauled him bodily up the side of the destroyer. He collapsed on the deck, shaking uncontrollably, expecting boots or rifle butts, expecting the end. Instead, someone threw a wool blanket over him, heavy, warm. It smelled like diesel and tobacco. An American voice, "Get him to the wardroom, Doc. We got another one." Klaus looked up. A ring of American sailors surrounded him, but they weren't pointing guns. One was cutting away his soaked uniform jacket with a knife, not to humiliate him, but to get the wet cloth off. Another was wrapping his feet in dry cloth. A third pressed a metal cup to his lips. Coffee, black and bitter and scalding hot. Klaus choked on it, coughed, and the sailor with the cup actually smiled. "Easy, buddy, easy. You're okay now. Okay." Klaus was a prisoner. He was the enemy. He had spent 4 years trying to sink American ships, and this sailor was telling him he was okay. They carried him below decks. The last thing Klaus saw before they took him down was the cargo nets still hanging over the side. More Germans being pulled from the water. Americans climbing down to help. And on the bridge wing, Captain Hutchkins, watching it all. Later, Klaus would understand what Hutchkins had risked: his career, his crew's safety, his mission success, everything a naval officer was supposed to protect. But in that moment, shivering under an American Navy blanket, Klaus understood only one thing. Nothing made sense anymore. The wardroom of USS Borie had been converted into an emergency aid station. Klaus was laid on a bench, still wrapped in blankets. While a Navy pharmacist's mate, the Americans called him Doc, though he was maybe 25, examined him with quick, professional efficiency. Hypothermia, exhaustion, some saltwater aspiration, Doc muttered to a sailor taking notes. But he'll live. Get his core temperature up. Warm water, not hot. And for God's sake, someone find dry clothes that will fit him. Klaus understood enough English to follow the conversation. They were treating him like a patient, not a prisoner, not an enemy, a patient. Doc noticed Klaus was listening. You speak English? Klaus nodded weakly. Little. Good. Listen to me. You've been in the water a long time. Your body temperature is dangerously low. We're going to warm you up slowly. It's going to hurt when the feeling comes back to your hands and feet. That's normal. Don't panic. Panic? Klaus almost laughed. He'd been beyond panic for hours. Now he was in some strange territory between relief and confusion that had no name. A young sailor appeared with dry clothes. Standard U.S. Navy dungarees and a wool sweater. These should fit, Doc. Took 'em from Morrison's locker. Morrison won't mind. Doc helped Klaus sit up. Can you dress yourself? Or do you need help? The question was asked matter-of-factly, without judgment. Klaus managed to change clothes with minimal assistance, his hands shaking from cold and shock. While Doc worked on Klaus, other American sailors were bringing in more German survivors. Werner Kahl, the young machinist, was carried in unconscious. Oberbootsman Hans Müller, the boat's senior petty officer, was helped to a bench, his left arm hanging at an odd angle. What struck Klaus wasn't just that the Americans were rescuing them, it was how they were doing it. No interrogation, no rough treatment, no mockery, just professional medical care and basic human decency. A petty officer appeared with a metal tray. Soup and sandwiches for the survivors, Doc. Klaus stared at the food. Hot soup, white bread with what looked like ham. In his 4 years in the Kriegsmarine, he'd heard endless stories about American brutality toward prisoners, but no one had mentioned they'd feed you. Go ahead, Doc said, noticing Klaus's hesitation. You need the calories. The soup was thin but hot. The sandwich was better than anything Klaus had eaten on U-521 inches weeks. He ate slowly, watching the Americans work. They moved with practiced efficiency, treating each German survivor with the same professional care. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Rodriguez, Klaus would learn his name later, sat down across from him. Rodriguez was maybe 22, dark-haired, with kind eyes that seemed too young for this war. You got a family back home? Rodriguez asked, pulling out a wallet. Wife? Kids? Klaus shook his head. Sister. Hamburg. Yeah? I got sisters too. 3 of them. Rodriguez showed Klaus a photograph. 3 young women standing in front of a house, smiling at the camera. That's Maria, Rosa, and Carmen. Live in San Antonio with my mom. Klaus studied the photograph. Normal people. Normal family. Like his sister Greta, who worked in a factory and wrote him letters about rationing and air raids. Your sisters. Safe? Klaus asked. Yeah, they're safe. Texas is pretty far from the fighting. Rodriguez looked at the photograph, then back at Klaus. Your sister in Hamburg. That's rough. I heard about the bombing. Klaus nodded. The RAF had hit Hamburg hard in '42. Greta's letters had stopped coming for 3 months. When they resumed, she wrote only that she'd moved in with their aunt. War's hell on families, Rodriguez said quietly. On everybody. It was such a simple statement, but it hit Klaus like a depth charge. This American sailor understood. The war wasn't just submarines and destroyers and tactical objectives. It was people, families, sisters who worried about brothers they might never see again. Doctor, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, the ship's medical officer, appeared to check on the patients. He examined Klaus's hands and feet, testing for frostbite. You're lucky, Brennan said. Another hour in that water, and you'd have lost fingers and toes. Maybe your life. Why? Klaus asked suddenly. The question had been building in him since he'd been pulled from the water. Brennan looked puzzled. Why what? Why? Save us? We are enemy. We sink your ships. Brennan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Because that's what we do. We're the United States Navy. We rescue people in distress, at sea. Doesn't matter what flag they sail under. But orders. Orders? Brennan smiled grimly. Son, there are orders. And then there are orders. Some come from admirals. Some come from something higher. Klaus didn't fully understand, but he sensed something important in the doctor's words. Rules written by men, and rules written by conscience. As the night wore on, Klaus watched the Americans work. They'd rescued all 19 German survivors. Not one had been lost after the rescue began. Not one had been mistreated. Petty Officer Rodriguez brought him a cup of coffee and sat down again. Doc says, "You'll be okay. We're taking you to a Canadian port, POW camp there." Klaus nodded. He'd expected as much. "Listen," Rodriguez said quietly. "I know you probably heard a lot of stories about how Americans treat prisoners. I don't know what your officers told you, but it's not like that. You'll be treated fairly." Klaus looked at this young American who had no reason to lie to him, who had no reason to show him kindness. "Why you tell me this?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Because somebody should. Because maybe when this war's over, you'll remember that we're not monsters. Maybe that'll matter." For the first time in 4 years, Klaus Barston began to think that maybe, just maybe, the propaganda had been wrong about everything. What Charles Hutchkins did that night in the North Atlantic wasn't just about saving 19 German sailors. It was about something much larger. The fundamental question of what rules mean in wartime, and who gets to decide when to break them. By rescuing those U-boat survivors, Hutchkins had violated direct orders from convoy command. But he had followed something else entirely: the Geneva Convention, the international laws of war that most Americans had never heard of, but that governed everything about how civilized nations were supposed to fight. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was crystal clear. Prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile government, but not of the individuals or corps who capture them. They must at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence. But here's what makes Hutchkins's decision remarkable. In 1943, the Geneva Convention was more aspiration than reality. Nazi Germany systematically violated it. Imperial Japan ignored it completely. The Soviet Union had never signed it. Even among the Allies, adherence was flexible. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Hutchkins's executive officer, understood the legal reality perfectly. 3 days after the rescue, he wrote in his personal log, "The captain's decision was legally correct under international law, but international law and operational orders don't always align. In war, you follow the orders that let you sleep at night." The broader strategic implications of Hutchkins's choice would echo for decades. Because how you treat defeated enemies determines what kind of peace you get when the war ends. Consider the contrast. In the Pacific, Japanese submarines routinely machine-gunned Allied survivors in the water. When captured Japanese submariners expected torture or execution, they fought to the death rather than surrender. The result? A vicious cycle of escalating brutality that made the Pacific War longer and bloodier than it needed to be. But in the Atlantic, despite propaganda on both sides, a different dynamic emerged. American and British forces generally followed Geneva Convention protocols for German prisoners. Not perfectly, not consistently, but genuinely. The result? German submarine crews increasingly chose surrender over suicide. Intelligence gathered from cooperative prisoners helped Allied forces hunt down remaining U-boats more effectively. Klaus Barston would later write, "The Americans who saved us didn't just rescue our bodies. They rescued our belief that civilized warfare was possible. When I was finally repatriated to Germany in 1947, I told everyone who would listen, the American way of war is different. But Hutchkins's decision also revealed a crucial truth about military leadership. Sometimes, being a good officer means disobeying orders. The German military had a term for this: Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, that expected junior officers to use their judgment to fulfill the commander's intent, even if that meant ignoring specific orders. Ironically, Hutchkins was practicing German military doctrine better than most German officers. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, who had written those no mercy orders, never officially reprimanded Hutchkins. When asked about it after the war, King said, "Good naval officers follow orders. Great naval officers know when not to follow orders." Hutchkins made the right call. The strategic wisdom of treating prisoners humanely became clear in the war's aftermath. Germany and Japan, despite being utterly defeated, became America's strongest allies within a decade. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. The occupation of Japan created a democratic society. Former enemies became partners in containing Soviet expansion. None of this was accidental. It flowed directly from thousands of individual decisions, like Hutchkins's, to treat defeated enemies as human beings worthy of basic dignity. Professor Dr. Klaus Barston, yes, the same Klaus who nearly drowned in May 1943, would later write in his doctoral dissertation on international relations, American hegemony in the post-war world rested not just on military victory, but on moral authority. That authority was earned one prisoner at a time, one act of mercy at a time. But there's a darker lesson here too. Rules matter most when they're hardest to follow. The Geneva Convention exists precisely for moments when it's inconvenient, when the enemy seems to deserve nothing, when following the rules costs more than breaking them. The contrast with totalitarian approaches is instructive. Nazi Germany saw prisoners of war as subhuman, worthy of slavery or death. The Soviet Union saw them as traitors or tools. Imperial Japan viewed surrender as dishonor, worse than death. But democracies, imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely, saw defeated enemies as soldiers with specific rights under specific laws. That difference wasn't trivial. It was the difference between the world that emerged after 1945 and the world that could have emerged if the Axis had won. Hutchkins understood this instinctively. Standing on that bridge in the North Atlantic, he wasn't just making a tactical decision about 19 German sailors. He was choosing what kind of nation America would be after the war ended. The immediate cost was real. USS Borie spent 4 hours conducting rescue operations. The convoy arrived in Liverpool 14 hours behind schedule. Fuel shipments were delayed. Tank production schedules were disrupted. Military planners could calculate exactly what Hutchkins's mercy cost in material terms, but they couldn't calculate what it was worth. The strategic value of demonstrating that American power was different from Nazi power, that democratic warfare was different from totalitarian warfare, that victory could be achieved without abandoning the principles that made victory worthwhile. Klaus Barston would spend the next 63 years of his life as a living testament to that difference. Every German who heard his story, every student he taught, every international conference where he spoke about prisoner rights, all of it flowed from Charles Hutchkins's decision to turn around. The ripple effects were immeasurable, and they started with one captain who decided that some rules are more important than orders. Klaus Barston spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Ontario, Canada. But his real education began the moment USS Borie's cargo nets hauled him from the Atlantic. For 2 years, Klaus experienced something no Nazi propaganda had prepared him for: dignity in defeat. Canadian Guards, who treated German prisoners with professional respect. Work details that paid fair wages, mail privileges that let him write to his sister, medical care when he broke his leg in a work accident, educational programs that taught him advanced English and introduced him to democratic political theory. Most importantly, Klaus learned that the Americans and Canadians weren't trying to break him, they were trying to rebuild him. By 1947, when Klaus was repatriated to Germany, he had become a different man, not just because of 2 years in a POW camp, but because of 4 hours on the deck of an American destroyer, where he learned that enemies could show mercy. Klaus returned to a Germany that barely existed. Hamburg was rubble. His sister Greta had married a British soldier she'd met during the occupation. Half his neighborhood had been erased by Allied bombing. The country that had started a war to rule the world was now divided among its former enemies. But Klaus had seen something during his captivity that most Germans hadn't: what American victory actually looked like. Not conquest, but reconstruction. Not revenge, but rehabilitation. Not permanent occupation, but partnership toward recovery. In 1951, Klaus used his perfect English and his engineering background to get a job with the Marshall Plan administration. He helped coordinate the rebuilding of Hamburg's port facilities, the same port from which U-521 had sailed to hunt American ships. The irony wasn't lost on him. Klaus worked alongside American engineers who knew exactly what he had done during the war. They didn't care. What mattered was building a democratic Germany that could stand as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Former enemies had become essential allies almost overnight. By 1955, Klaus had enrolled at Hamburg University to study international relations. His doctoral dissertation, completed in 1961, was titled Prisoner Treatment as Strategic Policy: How the American Approach to POWs Created Post-War Stability. The central argument was simple: how you treat defeated enemies determines what kind of peace you get. Klaus's research was exhaustive. He interviewed hundreds of German POWs who had been held by different Allied powers. The patterns were clear. Germans, held by Americans and British, generally returned home as advocates for democratic reconstruction. Germans, held by Soviets, returned as bitter enemies of everything Western. The difference? Treatment during captivity. The Americans understood something the Soviets did not, Klaus wrote. Vengeance creates enemies. Dignity creates allies. Klaus's academic career flourished. He became a professor at Hamburg University, teaching courses on international law and conflict resolution. But his most important work happened outside the classroom. In 1963, Klaus received a letter that would change everything. It was from Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchkins, now retired from the Navy and living in Rhode Island. Hutchkins had tracked Klaus down through academic journals. "Dear Professor Barston," the letter began, "I often wonder what happened to the 19 men we pulled from the Atlantic that night in May 1943. I'm glad to know at least one of them made something meaningful of his life. Would you be interested in corresponding?" What followed was a 20-year friendship between former enemies. Klaus and Hutchkins exchanged letters regularly, sharing stories about their families, their work, their perspectives on the Cold War. In 1968, Klaus traveled to the United States for the first time since his rescue. Hutchkins met him at the airport in Boston. The photograph from that meeting, two gray-haired men embracing at Logan Airport, became iconic. It was featured in Time magazine under the headline, "When Enemies Become Friends." The article described how an act of mercy in wartime had created a bridge between former adversaries. But the ripple effects went far beyond two men becoming friends. Klaus's children, Thomas and Christina, grew up hearing this story. Thomas became a professor of international relations like his father, specializing in post-conflict reconstruction. His PhD dissertation examined how prisoner treatment in various conflicts affected long-term regional stability. He concluded that the American approach in World War II, combining firm detention with basic dignity, was the most effective model for creating lasting peace. Christina Barston became a humanitarian lawyer working for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She spent 30 years advocating for prisoner rights in conflicts around the world, from Bosnia to Rwanda to Iraq. When she was interviewed for a documentary in 2010, she said, "My father always told us that someone showed him mercy when he deserved none. He spent his life trying to pass that forward. That's the real victory in war. Not the battles won, but the humanity preserved." The Hutchkins family carried forward their own version of this legacy. Mark Hutchkins became a naval officer like his father, serving in the surface fleet during the Vietnam War and later the Gulf War. He retired as a captain, the same rank his father held when he rescued Klaus. In Mark's retirement speech in 1995, he referenced his father's choice. "Dad taught me that following orders is essential, but knowing when to follow your conscience is wisdom." In his 30-year career, the thing he was most proud of wasn't the combat actions or the commendations. It was the day he turned around. The institutional impact was equally significant. Klaus's academic work on prisoner treatment became required reading at the Naval War College. His case studies influenced American military doctrine during the Cold War. When the Army developed new guidelines for prisoner handling in Vietnam, Klaus's research was cited extensively. More broadly, the story of Klaus and Hutchkins became part of the mythology of American exceptionalism. The idea that America fights wars differently, that American power is constrained by American values, that even in total war, certain principles remain inviolable. This wasn't just propaganda, it was strategy. During the Cold War, when the United States was competing with the Soviet Union for influence among newly independent nations, stories like Klaus's mattered enormously. They demonstrated that American leadership meant something different from Soviet domination. Klaus understood this better than most. In his 1975 book, The Moral Dimension of Strategic Power, he wrote, "The Soviet Union can offer satellite nations protection and economic aid, but only America can offer the promise that defeat need not mean humiliation, that cooperation with American power can preserve national dignity." These weren't abstract academic theories. They were lived experiences, born from 4 hours on the deck of a destroyer, where an American captain chose mercy over efficiency, and the ripples continued. Klaus's students became diplomats, military officers, international lawyers. Christina's work with the Red Cross influenced prisoner protocols in dozens of conflicts. Mark Hutchkins's naval career included training junior officers in the ethical dimensions of military command. Each generation passed forward the lesson. Humanity is a choice, even in war, especially in war. The lesson of Klaus Barston's rescue isn't just historical. It's urgently relevant to every conflict since, and especially to the moral challenges America has faced in the 21st century. On September 11th, 2001, everything changed. Suddenly, America was fighting enemies who didn't wear uniforms, who targeted civilians, who operated outside every conventional rule of warfare. The temptation to abandon principles that seemed designed for a different kind of war became overwhelming. The arguments were familiar to anyone who knew the Atlantic War. These are different enemies, playing by different rules. We need different methods. But Klaus's story offers a counter-argument that military leaders in Iraq and Afghanistan would have done well to remember. At Abu Ghraib prison in 2004, American soldiers tortured Iraqi detainees. The photographs shocked the world and damaged American credibility for decades. The justification was always the same. These prisoners had information that could save American lives. Normal rules didn't apply. Christina Barston, Klaus's daughter, was working for the International Committee of the Red Cross when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. Her response was swift and uncompromising. "My father was rescued by Americans who understood that how you treat enemies defines who you are. The soldiers at Abu Ghraib forgot that lesson. and America paid the price. The strategic cost was immense. Every image from Abu Ghraib became a recruiting tool for insurgents. Every leaked video of prisoner abuse convinced more Iraqis that American occupation was no different from Saddam Hussein's tyranny. The moral authority that had helped America win the Cold War was squandered in a few months of systematic brutality. Compare that to the interrogation of Klaus Barston in 1943. No torture. No enhanced interrogation techniques. Just professional questioning conducted within Geneva Convention guidelines. And Klaus provided more actionable intelligence about U-boat operations than any tortured prisoner ever provided about terrorist networks. The difference wasn't just moral, it was practical. Klaus cooperated because he had been treated with dignity, because he had seen that Americans were different from what he'd been told, because mercy had earned respect. At Guantanamo Bay, prisoners held for years without trial, many of whom turned out to be innocent, became symbols of American hypocrisy. The facility remains open today, a permanent reminder that America abandoned its own principles under pressure. Klaus lived to see Guantanamo established. In 2003, at age 81, he wrote an open letter to the Washington Post. "I was an enemy combatant held by Americans for 2 years. I was treated fairly, tried properly, and released when the war ended. Why is America afraid to do the same today? Has it forgotten what made its victory meaningful?" The letter went viral, as much as anything could, in 2003. It was reprinted in military journals, discussed in ethics classes at West Point, and cited in congressional hearings about detention policy. But the damage was done. A generation of military leaders had learned that rules were optional, that principles were luxuries America couldn't afford in the war on terror. General James Mattis, who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, understood what America had lost. In a 2005 speech to Marine officers, he said, "The moment you abandon the Geneva Convention, you've abandoned what makes you different from your enemies. You're not fighting for America anymore. You're just fighting." The psychological cost was equally devastating. Veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan struggled with what they had done, what they had witnessed, what they had been ordered to do. The suicide rate among veterans skyrocketed. PTSD cases multiplied. Klaus's insight proved prescient. Abandoning principles in war doesn't just harm enemies. It destroys the moral foundation that allows soldiers to live with themselves afterward. Charles Hutchkins had understood this intuitively in 1943. By saving Klaus and his crewmates, Hutchkins hadn't just preserved German lives, he had preserved his own conscience. He slept well for the rest of his life, knowing he had chosen humanity when policy and expedience pointed toward cruelty. How many American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan can say the same? The institutional memory of America's greatest generation, the generation that won World War II while preserving democratic values, was systematically ignored in the Bush administration's response to 9/11. Veterans like Hutchkins, who understood that American victory meant something more than just military success, were dismissed as outdated moralists who didn't understand modern warfare. But modern warfare, it turned out, required the same moral clarity that had guided Hutchkins in the North Atlantic, because in an age of global media and instant communication, every act of American cruelty became a strategic defeat. The parallels are exact. In 1943, Hutchkins faced the same choice that American commanders faced in 2003. Follow orders that prioritized short-term tactical advantage, or follow principles that preserved long-term strategic credibility. Hutchkins chose principles. The result was a Germany that became America's strongest ally in Europe. Bush administration officials chose tactics. The result was an Iraq that remains unstable 20 years later, and an America whose moral authority may never fully recover. Klaus Barston died in 2006, just as the full scope of American prisoner abuse was becoming clear. His final academic paper, published posthumously, was titled "The Wages of Abandoning Geneva: how America lost the moral high ground in the War on Terror. The conclusion was devastating. The Americans who saved me understood that victory without honor is just another form of defeat. Their successors forgot this lesson. The price will be paid for generations. That price is still being paid. America's allies question its commitment to human rights. Its enemies use American hypocrisy as justification for their own brutality. Its own soldiers struggle with the moral injury of fighting wars without clear ethical guidelines. The lesson Klaus learned on USS Borie, that mercy is not weakness, that dignity creates allies, that how you fight determines what you win, remains as relevant today as it was in 1943. Every American military officer should know Klaus Barston's story, not because it's inspiring, though it is, but because it's practical, because it demonstrates that following the rules isn't a constraint on victory, it's a prerequisite for meaningful victory. The choice Charles Hutchkins faced in the North Atlantic is the same choice America faces in every conflict. Become the nation it claims to be, or become just another empire imposing its will through force. Klaus spent 63 years proving that America could choose correctly. The question is whether America will remember how. So what's the truth about Charles Hutchkins breaking every rule that night in May 1943? The truth is this: he didn't break the rules that mattered most. Yes, Hutchkins violated direct orders from convoy command. Yes, he risked his career, his crew's safety, and his mission success. Yes, he delayed critical supplies to Britain by 14 hours. But he followed a higher law, the Geneva Convention, the international agreement that defines how civilized nations fight wars. More importantly, he followed the moral law that says human dignity transcends military necessity. The paradox of Hutchkins's choice reveals something profound about leadership in extreme circumstances. Sometimes, being a good officer means being a bad one first. Sometimes, following your conscience requires disobeying your orders. Klaus Barston understood this better than anyone. In his final letter to the Hutchkins family, written just months before his death in 2006, he wrote, "Your father didn't break the rules that night." He revealed what the real rules were. The real rules weren't written by admirals or politicians. They were written by centuries of human moral development, codified in international law, and embodied in the best traditions of military service. The rule that says, you rescue people in distress at sea, regardless of nationality. The rule that says defeated enemies deserve specific treatment under specific laws. The rule that says how you win determines what kind of victory you achieve. Hutchkins chose these eternal rules over temporary orders. He chose the permanent over the expedient. He chose what America aspired to be over what military efficiency demanded. And in doing so, he helped create the world we live in today. A world where former enemies became allies. Where international law, however imperfectly enforced, provides a framework for civilized conflict. Where the memory of American moral leadership, however tarnished by recent failures, remains a standard other nations aspire to match. Klaus Barston clung to wreckage in the North Atlantic for 19 hours, certain he would die, certain that if Americans found him, they would finish what the depth charges had started. He had been taught to expect nothing from his enemies except cruelty. Instead, he found humanity. A captain who risked his career to turn around. Sailors who climbed into freezing water to pull him out. A pharmacist's mate who treated his hypothermia like it mattered. A petty officer who showed him photos of his children. A guard in Canada who shared cigarettes and talked about going home. None of them had to do any of that. Policy required minimum treatment. They gave more than the minimum. They gave dignity. They gave respect. They gave proof that the propaganda was wrong. Klaus lived 63 years after that rescue. He rebuilt his country, raised a family, taught thousands of students, and never forgot the lesson of that night. Humanity is a choice, even in war, especially in war. The choices we make when everything screams for revenge and expedience, those define who we are. This wasn't just American military doctrine. This was American character. The belief that rules matter, that even enemies deserve specific treatment under specific laws. That how you win determines what you win. Charles Hutchkins didn't just save Klaus Barston's life that day in May 1943. He saved the idea that war doesn't have to make us monsters, that we can fight necessary fights without abandoning the principles we fight for. Klaus went into the water expecting death. He found humanity instead, and he spent the rest of his life proving that mercy is not weakness. It's the foundation of lasting peace,